Since the issue in this case has to do with the exemption from the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, there were a lot of questions and theories about whether it might apply here.
But even if you want to take a step back and look at what Congress was getting at more broadly, Congress's entire purpose was to prohibit lawsuits just like this one. It was trying to prohibit lawsuits that had been brought by the city of Chicago, the city of Cincinnati, the city of Boston on theories and seeking relief exactly like this one. So if you adopt my friend's position on the other side, you have essentially gutted PLACA. And remember what the larger purpose of PLACA was. It was actually to ultimately protect Second Amendment rights by preventing plaintiffs from bankrupting the industry through frivolous lawsuits. After all, the Second Amendment doesn't really mean anything if there's nobody from whom you can buy a firearm.
So PLACA was created not simply to protect gun manufacturers, but the Second Amendment itself. Cities like Chicago, Cincinnati, and Boston appear to think they could put gun manufacturers out of business by burying them in lawsuits. The fact that there was no correlation between the actions of the manufacturers and the crimes committed wasn't the point. It was how the cities could get guns off their streets, regardless of the intent of the person owning the firearm. In this case, the country of Mexico has a problem with cartels who are acquiring firearms to cause violence and mayhem. To get rid of these firearms, Mexico came up with its own theory about how to sue the manufacturers.
It reflects this convoluted theory that simply because the gun is found in Mexico can be traced back to a retailer. That means the retailer necessarily sold it illegally, and that we know that the retailer sold it illegally.
You know what they say about assumptions, right? Assuming that if a gun is found at a crime scene in Mexico, it must mean that it was sold illegally is quite a leap. But this case isn't dependent on one such leap, but several.
In your brief, you summarized the chain that you've mentioned or alluded to a number of times. Mm-hmm. Would you just list the chain for our benefit?
Sure. Starts out with a licensed manufacturer, a manufacturer that the federal government says is allowed to make firearms. It then distributes its legal firearms to licensed distributors who the federal government says are allowed to distribute them. They then sell to licensed retailers that the federal government says are allowed to retail. Those retailers, some very small percentage of them, unknown number, but some small percentage of them, transfer those firearms illegally to straw purchasers. The straw purchaser then hands it over to the actual purchaser. You then have a smuggle across an international border, yet another violation of law. The smuggler then presumably gives it to the cartels who are illegally possessing the firearm in Mexico under Mexican law, as my friends have described it. Then the Mexican cartels engage in murder and mayhem against the good people of Mexico, all of which in turn causes the Mexican government to have to spend money to respond to that murder and mayhem. With respect, there's not a single case in history that comes close to that. They don't even cite cases that find a manufacturer, I think, ever liable for the unlawful criminal misuse of its products, other than the cases that PLACA was meant to prohibit, and perhaps other than the Avis case, the Florida Supreme Court case. But they certainly don't cite anything that comes close to that chain of causation, which is more extreme than the cases that PLACA was meant to prohibit.
Mexico's position seemed to be several leaps too far, and certainly not the knowing violation of state or federal law that would trigger the PLACA exception.